Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new to the channel, my name is James and this is Career Insights. In this video, I'm going to cover the three types of project manager that you generally find in construction, which is client-based, consultancy-based and site-based project managers. I'm going to go through each of those in a bit more detail, giving some background and giving some examples for you to understand what those roles involve. So let's jump into it. So to kick us off, let's start with the site-based project manager. Now, site-based project managers tend to work for main contractors or developers. Now, it doesn't really matter if it's either the two or it's other businesses. The main function of that business they work for is building. That's how they make their money. So if a contractor, obviously the only way they make their money is by delivering projects for other people. And if it's developers, they obviously need to build either residential developments or commercial developments for them to sell or to rent to make their money. So their prime function revolves around those premises. So that's why it's a big part of what makes up those companies. So the term itself, project manager, so often gets confused with the term site manager. Now the distinction that I would have between that is that the project manager is kind of the top of the tree when it comes to actually the site level running of the project. So he will have, or she will have, 2 or 3, say, site managers beneath them, and they may have a finishing foreman coming in towards the end of the project. Very large scale projects will have even more levels than that. So what you will find is that it may have an M&E site manager, they might have a civil site manager, they might have a cladding site manager. But at the end of the day, they all report back to the project manager. The team itself will have a broader team. It might have a design manager, it may have a QS on site or a team of QSs on site. But the theme is that essentially the main function of the project manager is to deliver that scheme from start to finish, and they are site-based, on-site 24/7. They may go back to the office once a week or once a month, just in general in terms of reporting back as to what's going on. But their responsibility is to deliver that scheme. So the project manager will tend to get involved in the scheme roughly about 1 to 3 months before it actually physically starts on site. Now, what they'll be doing is they'll be working with the pre-construction manager, probably the programmer, they'll be working with the design team and probably the QS for the project in identifying all of the subcontractors that need to be appointed with the QS. So they'll go through interviews in that process. They'll be working with the pre-construction manager on the design philosophy, handing over in terms of what surveys have been undertaken, working with the design manager in terms of is it a steel frame, is it concrete frame, okay, or who are we talking to about those different details, bringing everybody together, probably now starting to go to design team meetings. So that's what they're doing in the very initial stages. And what they'll also be doing is probably talking to a contracts manager or the construction director over allocating resources going forward for the project, i.e. internal resources. Do we have enough site managers? Who's coming free from other projects that can work on this? So it's important to remember at the beginning of a construction project, there's obviously limited number of works that take place, or that they take place one at a time. So for instance, your demolition phase will generally be undertaken by itself. You will get in a couple of other specialists, but generally speaking, it's 1 to 2 contractors that are undertaking the demolition phase. And the same goes with civils. So at the beginning of the project, you've kind of got 1 to 2 contractors on site at a time. So there's actually less management involved. So what you might find is that the site may run, say, with 1 site manager at the beginning, or maybe the project manager will run the site at the beginning, but then it needs additional resources as that begins to ramp up. So if we fast forward, say, to the finishes, where I mentioned earlier that a finishing foreman would get involved, obviously at that point, you're in the height of all of the different subcontractors being on site potentially at the same time, particularly if it's a multi-phase development. So your civils, for example, will be carrying on at exactly the same time as you're now finishing off, say, an apartment as you're going. So the project manager ultimately sits at the top of that tree in managing all of the different site managers and having the overall responsibility to deliver the project on time and to the required specification. So that is a really good overview of what a site-based project manager is. The second type of project manager is client-based. Now what I mean by this is that the primary function of the business that they work for probably isn't construction related. So to give a good example, someone like Tesco's, their primary function for making money is to sell food. But obviously to sell food, they need stores, they need warehouses to store the food in. So by that byproduct, they obviously have a ton of property. They've also got a ton of construction work or refurbishment work they need to undertake each year. So there's a whole host of businesses that are like this. So you could use Amazon as an example, you could use Microsoft. They've obviously got tons of data centers that they build out. It could be retail, like Ralph Lauren owning a store, renovating stores, adding new stores to their portfolio. So the examples are endless, but one of the commonalities with this type of project manager is that those companies, they don't tend to have a linear form of how many projects they undertake each year. So to put it another way, one year they may be undertaking 100 projects, the next year they may only be carrying out 25 projects. Maybe they've had a bad financial year and they don't want to expend as much money onto new projects as what they were originally forecasting. So what that means is that those companies tend to keep small teams together, and what they'll do is they'll hire in additional services or consultants when they're in busy periods, because what they ultimately don't want to be doing is hiring and firing every year to cope with the different workload that they're undertaking. So the team will stay relatively small, but they'll add to it via consultants. So the PM itself, what they'll be doing is obviously working on a whole host of projects all at once. So they could be working on anywhere from 3 projects to 10 projects at one time, but they could be at so many different stages of the construction process. So they'll obviously be a lot more tied to the business case than a construction-based site manager will. So for example, they'll be looking at feasibilities as to whether something's possible. So the business may want to open 5 new stores, it may have X budget, and does that budget cover them opening those 5 stores? So those types of project managers will be working on feasibilities quite a lot. They also will have stuff on site, but what they'll be doing is they'll be going to site to visit the construction-based project manager to see if everything's progressing well. They'll probably visit site maybe once or twice a week, and they'll be making sure that the specification is being met, that the budget's going well, but generally just making sure that everything is staying on track. But going back to my point on working on multiple projects at one time, one of the things that you have to accept if you wanted to go into this type of project management is that when you're working on feasibility projects quite a lot of the time, probably up to 50% of what you work on will probably get thrown in the bin. That means that you'll be working on stuff that actually when you get to the bottom of it, it's just not feasible. So you'll be throwing it in the bin. So you tend to have quite thick skin in a different sense than obviously the other types of PM. So the challenges facing this PM compared to a site-based PM are quite different. So a site-based PM is obviously working concurrently through a program, which means that they obviously have a starting point and an end point. A client-based PM obviously is working on so many different projects at one time that are all at different stages. So they can be jumping into something that is, say, at the finishing stages on one site, but they could be working on 2 feasibilities back in the office that one looks like it's going to be a success, the other one looks like it's going to be a failure. So that's the different challenges that they have, is that their headspace is kind of all over the place depending on where the different projects are, whereas a construction project completely has its own issues and stresses, but it's just a different type of stress where you're just trying to meet demands, stay on program, stay on budget, those type of aspects of it. So, but going back to my point I said earlier about client-based PMs, whenever they're ramping up, tend to outsource. What they tend to do is they tend to outsource for consultants, and that's where my next point leads on to, which is consultant-based project managers. So let's jump into that one. So consultant project managers is the last project management type. Now, you may have heard of 2 terms, one being contract administrators or the other one being employer's agent. Now, employer's agent is probably my favourite out of the 2 terms because it kind of says what it is on the tin. So if you think about it, that a client is hiring you to work on their behalf, that's what employer's agent means. So, but what you'll find in the industry is that the consultancies themselves, so using some big ones, AECOM, WSP, they're big international companies, they all tend to call the employer's agent role, or the guys covering those positions, project managers. Can also be QSs, but we'll get into that in a bit more detail as we go along. Now, their involvement or their scope from project to project will be completely different. So using the example I gave before of client-based project managers, obviously they're already in the industry and they'll be obviously just looking for additional help to help them cover on projects. So they may need a reduced scope of help to work with them, compared to, say, a client that has no construction experience whatsoever or doesn't have any construction department within their company. And that's the bit I'm going to focus on because that allows me to talk about the role in a bit more detail. So to give you a good example, let's use a university that wants to expand its campus. So obviously universities probably only carry out construction works maybe every 5, 10, 15 years of a significant scale. Obviously they're doing refurbishment works, but I'm talking about major new building, that type of works. So what they'll probably have is an aspiration in terms of square foot or square meters that they want to add. and a budget next to it. So they'll go out to a consultant and they'll say to them, like, this is the data that we've got. Do you think this is feasible? And what they'll do is they'll probably look at projects they've completed in the last 3 to 5 years, look at that data and say whether it is or it isn't. Ultimately, let's just say it is, and they're going to move ahead. Now, consultants, this is where it massively varies over what role and how much they're going to do, but obviously they could pull together a design team, get quotes in for that. But I see that less typically, but what I do see a lot of is that they will go out and source a tender list. So for the main contractors to undertake the work, so they might pull together 5, 6, 7 main contractors who are all interested in carrying out the works. They'll pull together a specification. They'll review the prices that come back in with the client, make their recommendations, and then they will execute the contract, which basically means getting the client and the contractor to sign up and to get going on site. Once it's on site, their role kind of turns into like an observing role. So they'll chair meetings once a month. They'll carry out valuation on the works, and the valuation aspect is quite important. So what you'll find in the recession, you'll see in my recession video, is that this is probably the most bulletproof role in construction, because what happens in a recession is that banks obviously tend to loan out for any type of construction project. Doesn't matter if you go back to that university example, they're probably getting a loan from the bank to fulfill that. So when they do, the banks obviously want their money best protected. So they'll say, hey, I think you should use an employer's agent or a construction project manager to oversee the works, oversee the valuations. Because obviously from the bank's perspective, they want to make sure that their money is very well protected. So to give an example of something that could go wrong is that the main contractor might be overvaluing the works. They might have cash flow issues on other sites because of, say, what's going on at the minute. So therefore they're trying to bump up how much money they're getting paid from this site. And that's where you need someone who is in the industry, that knows the value of the products, knows how the contract works inside out, to carry out those valuations. So the banks will tell people, particularly on large projects, and that's the other thing with consultant project managers, is that they tend to be on larger projects. One, from a perspective of covering their fee. Obviously, if you're in the industry, it's almost like a luxury to have a consultant like this on it. So obviously the bigger the project, the more likely they are able to add value in bringing their expertise into it and taking things out of it. So it was a very simple build. It's obviously difficult for them to justify their fee and difficult for them to bring value to the table. But the other side of it is like what I said with banks, is that if it's a big project, banks tend to want to look after their money and enforce it, and they may actually have their own list of consultants that they've essentially approved that they're willing for you to use to get on this sign off. So going back to what they do on a day-to-day basis is that type of monthly overview, valuations, site meetings, liaising with the client to make sure that if there's any decisions that need to be made on specification, or there might be conflicts between written specification documents and drawings, that's quite a common thing that happens, that they're going back to the client and say, can you clarify which of these two details are we undertaking? Or it might be a variation that's come into the contract that the client wants something new, and they will make the contract variations to allow the contractor to continue on, and obviously monitor any changes that are impacted via that, which may be that change in time or extension of time they need to undertake. So that's their role in a nutshell. That's the 3 types of project managers that you'll find in construction. They're obviously all very different from one another. Obviously one's a consultancy based, so consultancy is its own specialism. The other is client based, so you're going to be a lot more focused on the business needs and working on feasibilities a lot of the time. And then obviously the other one is delivering construction projects at a site-based level. So all very, very different, but they all can obviously work together. And you'll see that in a lot of projects where all 3 of those project managers are all working on the same project together for the same outcome. So there's massive overlaps in how the roles actually are on a day-to-day basis, but they're very, very different. So hopefully you got some value from that video. I thought it was a really good one to do, because I think it's something that a lot of people get confused over, thinking that project managing construction just means this, when ultimately it doesn't. There's a ton of different roles out there to be undertaken. If you did get value from the video, please smash the like button and the subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next one.